On this edition of the Newsmakers, leaving the ICC, we ask what's behind South Africa's decision to withdraw from the court that prosecutes the world's most egregious atrocities. Also on today's program, a shift in the Philippines' foreign policy. Is President Duterte severing his country's ties with the United States? And in Picture This, clearing the jungle. French police clash with refugees during the final hours of the Calais refugee camp. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Now, last week, South Africa announced it will withdraw from the International Criminal Court. The decision follows the government's refusal to arrest Sudanese President Al-Bashir during an official visit to South Africa last year. In spite of an ICC warrant for alleged war crimes against him, South Africa claimed Bashir had diplomatic immunity as a head of state. Now, there's been growing criticism of the ICC in recent years. Since its creation in 2002, the court has only brought Africans to trial, and it's been accused by some of bias against African countries and leaders. Our newsmaker today is South Africa, as we ask whether its decision to leave the ICC is justified or if it disregards justice.
Heralded as a court to bring justice for the world's atrocities and the best means to pursue perpetrators of the most heinous crimes. But last week, South Africa gave notice. It wants out of the International Criminal Court.
The withdrawal will take effect 1 year after the Secretary General has received the notification.
South Africa says the court's obligations are at odds with its domestic laws on diplomatic immunity. Last year, it was heavily criticised for ignoring a court order to arrest visiting Sudanese President Omar Al-Bashir, wanted by the ICC for genocide and war crimes, accusations he denies. It's the second African nation this month to make moves to withdraw from the tribunal, with Burundi's parliament voting to leave. Although the UN has yet to be officially notified. The UN says it regrets South Africa's decision, and human rights groups warn pulling out is a mistake that shows startling disregard for justice. But for many in Africa, the ICC doesn't represent their interests, accusing it of bias towards African countries. South Africa is the first country to withdraw from the ICC since it opened in 2002. Of its 124 member countries, 34 are African. Of the 10 inquiries involving countries the ICC has opened, all but one have been African nations. And all those tried by the court have been black and African. The African Union has been a strong critic of the court in recent years, and many countries have threatened to withdraw. But the ICC denies it unfairly targets the continent, pointing out that many of its cases were self-referred, such as Uganda's request for it to prosecute commanders of the Lord's Resistance Army, including fugitive Joseph Kony. The court's chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, who is Gambian, thinks African nations should support the ICC.
Saying that ICC is targeting Africa or African leaders, which I do not agree with. I think ICC is working for Africa and with African victims.
So will other African nations follow suit and pull out of the ICC? And what would be the consequences for international justice? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Johannesburg is Dewa Mabinga. He is a senior researcher for the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. And from Minneapolis, I'm joined by Abdi Ismail Samatar. He is a professor in African Studies from the University of Minnesota. Thanks both so much for joining us. Abdi, let me begin with you. Why is leaving the ICC the right thing for South Africa and other African countries to do?
I think it's first pleasure to be with you. First, I think it's important to think of justice across the globe. What my concern is that there is unequal justice for different kinds of human beings across the globe. So for instance, if you look at what the European Union, and particularly France and Britain, did in Libya, and the cost to human people in that country, and nobody's looking at Tony Blair and Sarkozy and David Cameron as sort of a culprits in that process. The ICC is not looking at it. So if one is going to apply the rule of law uniformly, then I think the Africans should support the ICC. But as long as that law is deployed and applied indifferently, for instance, if you look at Palestine, what has happened there, nobody's being held responsible. So I think there has to be equal justice for the ICC to claim that it's neutral, legal institution.
Okay, Dewa Mavinga, you think South Africa is making a big mistake. Why?
Absolutely. What South Africa has done by seeking to withdraw from the ICC is to abandon victims of some of the most serious abuses and atrocity crimes. South Africa needs to act in line with values that are in its post-apartheid constitution, and also to acknowledge that it has a legacy of being a country that in the past has stood with the victims of some of the most serious abuses. So leaving the ICC sends a wrong message, which South Africa should be very careful about, because it does undermine South Africa's standing both regionally and globally as a leader in terms of human rights respect and international justice.
Abdi Ismail Samatar, why do you think it is not a case of Africans actually making use of the court rather than the ICC targeting Africa?
Well, the question is, if the International Court of Justice is an international organization that deals with justice and injustice across the globe, then they should pursue all cases, whether they are African or Asian or European or Latin American or whatnot.
But perhaps...
the question here, ma'am, is that Africans are being dealt with separately from from criminal acts that are committed by Europeans and North Americans in different parts of the world. And so what the Africans are pointing at is not to say that we are withdrawing simply because we are being targeted. It's target everybody equally. And that's not what the ICC has done. So the question of South Africa withdrawing does not mean that justice will be abandoned in South Africa, because, as my colleague talked about, the Constitution of South Africa is very, very clear on that. What matters here is that all the victims of injustice should have their day in court, and that the ICC should bring George Bush, Tony Blair, David Cameron, President Sarkozy, and everybody else who have committed crimes against humanity.
But let me ask you, Abdi Ismail Samatar, if not the ICC, then what? What alternative is there? It's not perfect, but must it be completely left behind?
No, I think that Africans as a collective and the AU as a collective should challenge this, rather than each and every country sort of doing its own thing. So if the AU means an African Union, then they should have to frontally confront this. What I'm thinking here is this, is that this is not to say that there has not been no criminality committed in Rwanda, or Burundi, or in Ethiopia as we currently speak, or elsewhere in the continent. But the same kind of crimes have been committed. Look at the sort of things that are taking place in Syria today, and in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. Who is responsible for that? So what the Africans can do is leave the ICC if it's not reformed, and establish then, as is the case in Arusha, Tanzania, an African justice court that will deal with these matters, that will deal with all Africans equally, rather than the European court doing this for them.
Dewa Mavinga, can an African Court of Justice provide a proper alternative to the ICC?
Not quite. The idea is that the ICC is a global court of last resort. So yes, there is need for strong domestic and regional justice mechanisms in Africa to ensure justice, but that does not justify doing away with the ICC. We need more platforms for accountability, not less. When you have strong domestic institutions, when you have a strong regional court for Africa, then it means that they would play their role in a complementary function, so that we have both justice at Africa level as well as at a global level, with the ICC being a court of last resort. And that would not, therefore, necessitate moving away from the ICC. It would only mean that victims have more platforms from where they can get justice.
Abdi Ismail Samatar, is that not sufficient?
That's insufficient. That's the usual human rights liberal organizations call. So, for instance, why is the ICC has not gone after George W. Bush? Why has it not gone after
Because they're not
Tony
signatories.
Well, I mean, so the question is, if the Africans are only going to be those who become the focus of the ICC.
But don't we have to respect that they signed on in the first place?
Well, the presumption of they had at the time they were signing was that this was going to be a global justice court. It is no longer that. And so the question is, the powerful countries can abstain from this, and then this becomes sort of the kangaroo's court for people like Africans and Asians. If you like, there's only one Asian case as far as I know, and then most of this is African. So Africans have to withdraw from this and negotiate internationally if we are going to have an international court of justice. If this is a court of justice for the weak, then I don't think it's a court of justice at all.
Deba, if you have a reply, go ahead. If not, I'd like to move on to another topic.
Well, it is important to note that, yes, the global power dynamics come to play, and the ICC is not perfect as an institution, but the scope for reform should be from within and not to abandon the idea of a global court of justice, which is a court of last resort. So yes, there may be valid criticisms about reform, but the solution is not the way South Africa has gone about it. The solution is to ensure that there is greater effectiveness and efficiency within the ICC going forward, but not by abandoning the court.
Okay, Deba, let me ask you, how is South Africa supposed to uphold its own diplomatic immunity laws if it is a signatory to the ICC? It can't have it both ways.
Well, what is clear within the ICC statute is that it does not bar peace negotiations. And also, the idea is that immunity for heads of states would encourage impunity. So yes, it would be possible for South Africa to ensure that there are peace negotiations within other frameworks, but at the same time, ensuring that there is global justice. What is now happening is that South Africa appears to have chosen good relations with other heads of states ahead of global peace, when in fact, ensuring justice would, in the long term, ensure that you have lasting and sustainable peace.
Okay, Abdi, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think it's important. The Africans who signed the ICC originally thought this was going to be a global court of justice that will bring everybody to power. They were naive enough in the sense that the Americans have not signed, the Brits have not signed, and so on and so forth. So it's another northern institution situated in the north, making justice for the Africans and others. And so I think there's a rethinking going on in Africa, not to get away from injustice, not to get away from justice, to hold everybody accountable, but it means everybody accountable. And South Africa and others will come back to the International Court of Justice when it proves to be a holistic, inclusive court that holds the powerful and the powerless equally to justice. As long as that's not done, I think Africans will have to rethink this, in my opinion.
Okay. Deba, let me ask you, the fear now is that the dominoes may have been set in motion, which could lead to the end of the ICC altogether. Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
There is that real fear, yes. And this is the time, we believe, for those ICC member states on the African continent and elsewhere to reaffirm their support for the court at this time. And we believe that it is possible, even at this time, for South Africa to reconsider its view on leaving the ICC, because there are serious questions about the validity of the manner in which South Africa moved out in terms of whether or not it has complied with its own internal laws, for example, because it bypassed Parliament. So it is not all lost. There is hope, if South Africa reconsiders and if other states reaffirm their support for the ICC.
Okay, Dewa Mavinga, I'll let you have the last word. I'd like to thank both of our guests so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the Newsmakers, rhetoric or change of policy. On his visit to China, Philippines President Duterte calls for a split with the United States. And in Picture This, anger and desperation as French police remove thousands of refugees from the makeshift Calais camp. Since taking power in June, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has been making headlines for his controversial war on drugs and his offensive comments toward various world leaders, including U.S. President Barack Obama. Now, the two leaders were supposed to meet during an ASEAN summit last month, but Obama canceled the meeting after Duterte described him in vulgar terms. Now, Duterte has repeatedly threatened to throw out U.S. special forces operating in his country. And while visiting China last week, he went a step further, calling for a split between the two countries. Natalie Pohonen reports.
President Rodrigo Duterte's pivot to China has made diplomatic waves. On his visit to Beijing, he secured $24 billion in funding and investment pledges and announced an historic shift in Philippine-US relations.
I announce my separation from the United States.
Once he was back on home soil, though, he clarified that it wasn't a complete break.
Separation of my foreign policy, that it need not dovetail the foreign policy of America. That's what I meant, actually. Even severe is to cut. Separate is just to chart another way of doing it.
Since entering office, Duterte has barely spoken to US President Barack Obama, but he has insulted him. That behavior, coupled with anti-American rhetoric, has baffled officials.
The succession of controversial statements and comments and a real climate of uncertainty about the Philippines' intentions has created consternation in a number of countries, not only in mine.
Duterte's desire to separate from American influence signifies a fundamental shift between the allies. The US and the Philippines are bound militarily. The Mutual Defense Treaty from 1951 means the countries have to come to each other's aid. This was boosted by the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2014. It was seen as a way to bolster the country's rights to territory in the disputed South China Sea. The issue of ownership in that area has shaped the Asia-Pacific region in recent years and has formed a key part of Barack Obama's pivot to Asia. China has welcomed Duterte's decision to foster friendship and put territorial claims to the side.
那么对于中方来讲，我们认为在当今的国际关系当中，我们不应该抱着冷战思维。
That places the US in a delicate diplomatic position. Some Duterte supporters are backing him. But many Filipinos have a favorable view of the US. A survey, 76% trust the US, but only 22% have much trust in China. Duterte has consistently said his only master is the Filipino people and not the outside world. If this rhetoric proves unpopular, could it be enough to make him backtrack from this policy? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, Richard W. Murphy joins me now from New York. He is a former U.S. ambassador to the Philippines. Ambassador Murphy, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, from your perspective, has there ever been a time when U.S.-Philippine relations have felt this strained?
Well, we've had strain, certainly in the past. Just before I arrived in Manila myself to take up the job as ambassador. It was in 1978. There were demonstrations in front of the American embassy in Manila about the military relationship then, and that has been off and on a sore point on the part of certain political leaders in Manila and the Philippine public and the American government.
Okay, but that was almost, wow, that was almost 40 years ago. Go ahead, you think it's important?
Well, that's true. I think that's what's going on right now is kind of a puzzle, because the United States has been very supportive of the Philippines in its diplomatic confrontation with China over the South China Sea, and that support has been welcomed. And all of a sudden, the President Duterte is talking of a separation and ending of the confrontation with China on his part, on the part of the Philippines, on that issue. Okay, well, that's his approach. He thinks he's going to do better directly negotiating with the government of China. He's had a good visit in Beijing, and let's see what develops.
It is important, as you say, but the numbers we saw in that report showing that the vast majority of the Philippine public supports a strong relationship, almost 75%, while only a quarter of them actually support stronger relations with China. So do you think that might change if Duterte stays in power? Do you have a feeling the Philippine public might lean toward China with him, or may end up rebelling against him in a sense?
Well, again, I think it's a bit early to make solemn pronouncements about the public moving one way or the other. But you're right, there is a long-standing, solid relationship between the public in the Philippines and in the United States. We have a Philippine-American community, Filipino community in this country of some, I think it's between 3 and 4 million people who have had good lives here, who have been a source of support to their families back in the Philippines, and there's been an increasingly good investment climate for American business these last few years. The relationship is looked on favorably, whether it's 76%, 70%, that's extremely high.
Well, then tell me how you think the U.S. should respond right now. How careful, perhaps, do you suggest it should be in its response and not upping the rhetoric themselves?
Well, there's no point in upping the rhetoric. The Philippine president on his home turf is known as a man who speaks roughly, speaks directly, and I don't think it's our part to respond in that manner. What's important to remember is there's been no formal government-to-government request to change the Mutual Defense Treaty or the support of the executive level agreement on defense cooperation. Now, let's see the reaction he'll get from the Philippine Senate, from the House, from the public. The Philippine press is very active and quick to comment on its own leaders' handling of issues. I'm optimistic this is going to work out.
Okay, so I mean, having said that then, do you think this just could be a case of Duterte, in a sense, kind of catering to his base supporters, while his diplomats and representatives will do otherwise? They will tone down the rhetoric, so to speak.
Well, I think they will tone it down, but look, I am not forgetting there is a long history of some resentment in dealing with the Philippines. We've been accused of being condescending and arrogant, et cetera, et cetera. So against that background, this outburst is not frankly surprising to me.
Okay, Richard W. Murphy, thank you so much for joining us there from New York. In today's Picture This, it's the end of the dream for thousands of refugees and migrants who were hoping to get to the United Kingdom. French police have begun an operation to clear them from the so-called jungle camp in the northern city of Calais. Here's a look. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.